Hey everybody, I'm Pastor Rory and I'm coming to you from Jakarta, Indonesia. I want to talk about some things today going along with the same theme of false conversion. We've talked in the past about a new gospel. I've talked about how our generation has changed the content of the gospel. I want to take that a little bit further today and point out that our generation is not just preaching another gospel, but actually preaching another Christ. You see, our generation is preaching another God, a God that doesn't exist, in fact, outside of their own imaginations. But we are now in the middle of a generation that knows nothing of the wrath of God. In fact, when you mention the wrath of God today, oftentimes many preachers will talk about God's wrath and they will mock God's wrath as if God's wrath was an Old Testament theme or just something kind of weird. We don't understand, the wrath, but we just kind of we belittle it. We talk around it. We say like God's not that way anymore. And that is just an absolute lie. It is just absolute blasphemy. God is eternal. He never changes. His character never changes. He's always righteous and holy, and He's always angry at sin. There's a psalm that says that God is angry with the wicked every day. And when Paul, the New Testament apostle, is preaching the gospel of grace, his starting point is the wrath of God. Just read Romans chapter 1. The very first point of his gospel is that God's anger is revealed against all men everywhere. We're in a generation now that knows nothing of a God of judgment. In fact, we mock those things. We belittle those things. We're preaching a Jesus who's all about love, but it's a different kind of love than the love the Bible talks about. We're of a generation that talks about a God of grace, but it's a different kind of grace than what the Bible talks about. We talk about all these blessings, but it's a different type of blessing than what the Bible talks about. You see what we're doing, what we've done, what our generation is guilty of, what our pastors are guilty of, what our missionaries are guilty of, what our evangelists are guilty of. We're not just preaching another gospel. We're preaching another God. We're preaching a God that does not exist. We're preaching a God of love with no wrath. We're preaching a God of mercy with no righteousness. We're preaching a God who has no real holiness, but only in theory. We're preaching a God who doesn't condemn the wicked. We're preaching a God that doesn't bring judgment against the nations. We've ripped out the book of Revelation and we've thrown it way off in the future, and as if God is no longer a God of wrath. Well, you want to say He's not a God of wrath? The book of Revelation is a future thing, and that's God, and He's revealing His wrath. And we're a generation that doesn't like to talk about the fear of God. The whole Bible's filled with the fear of God. Old Testament, New Testament, all the way through. What has happened? What kind of a God are we preaching? The love we preach is more a New Age love than a Christian love. The sort of God we preach is more like a Santa Claus in the sky than the Holy One of Israel. And I think it's unquestionable that our generation has committed in the Christian church. I'm not talking about outside of it. I'm not talking about the emergent church, whereas, of course, they're guilty as well. I'm talking about the evangelical, Pentecostal, charismatic, Reformed. All these groups are guilty of making a golden calf and bowing down and calling it Jesus. We've made a God in our own image, and we've preached a gospel of the God in our own image, but He bears absolutely no resemblance to the true God of the Bible, to the true God of the living Word. We go to the Bible, we read the Bible, and we find the God that we have in our own hearts, the God of our imaginations, because that's what we're looking for. We're not hungry for truth. We're not hungry for the true God. We're just hungry for more of what we already believe is to be. And that's why we don't have true revival, and that's why we don't have true conversions, and that's why we have so little of the true power of God, because we're not preaching the true God, and we're not preaching the true gospel, and we are a bunch of idolaters, and we have idols in our hearts, and so what we look for is what we get, and we're just reproducing the same thing over and over again.